Some histories follow a clear, predictable path. Nations rise and fall, stories unfold in straight lines. But then there are histories that refuse to be defined by simplicity. They are born from chaos, shaped by decisive moments that challenge our understanding. The history of Canada is one of those stories. Imagine a world where the land was already alive with vibrant cultures, and then, without warning, Europeans arrive, claiming the land as their own. What followed? A battle for survival, for land, for identity. The Beaver Wars, where nations fought for furs that could tip the balance of power. A brutal conquest, the fall of New France, and the British Crown taking control. A rebellion on the frozen plains of Saskatchewan, where a man named Louis Riel would either be remembered as a hero or a traitor, his death forever changing the fight for Indigenous rights. And through it all, a nation struggled to find itself, torn between loyalty to the British Crown and the pull of a new identity. The building of railroads that promised unity, but also led to the forced displacement of communities. Indigenous children taken from their families, a generation lost in the cold halls of residential schools, and then, years later, a nation forced to face its own truth. From the first contact to the broken promises, from Confederation to the quest for sovereignty, Canada's history is not one of simple triumph. It is a series of defining moments, where every decision shaped the land and people we know today. This is not just the story of Canada. It's the story of survival, sacrifice, and a nation still fighting to define its past and future. In 1534, a new chapter in the history of the land now known as Canada began. Jacques Cartier, a French navigator, set sail from St. Malo, a small port town in France, across the vast Atlantic Ocean. His mission was to find a passage to the riches of the Far East, but what he discovered instead would change the course of history forever. Cartier's journey led him to the shores of the land we now call the Gulf of St. Lawrence, a fertile and uncharted region that would soon bear witness to a collision of worlds. Cartier's first sight of this land was one of breathtaking beauty. The green-clad shores teemed with life, forests dense with towering trees and rivers flowing with the promise of wealth. But as Cartier ventured inland, he encountered something he had not expected: people. The Iroquois, a powerful and sophisticated people who had called these lands home for generations, greeted him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Their village, nestled along the banks of the St. Lawrence River, was called Canada, a word that would soon echo through the history of this land. Cartier, unaware of the profound implications of this encounter, latched onto the term and, in his own way, began the process of naming this land. The word Canada was born, a name that would grow to represent not just a village, but an entire continent. The initial exchange between Cartier and the Iroquois was one of mutual curiosity, as the two groups cautiously navigated their differences. The French, eager to establish their presence, began to trade goods such as copper, beads, and iron tools with the Iroquois. In return, the Indigenous people provided the French with their expertise in the local environment, teaching them how to fish the waters, navigate the rivers, and survive in this untamed land. It was a fragile alliance, one built on necessity rather than trust, but it was enough to plant the seeds for future cooperation. However, Cartier's vision was not just a trade. He was here to settle and lay the foundations of a French colony. His first journey back to France in 1536 was filled with promises of riches, but when he returned to the St. Lawrence, the challenge of establishing a permanent settlement became clear. The harsh winter had taken its toll. The men were sick, supplies were running low, and the relationship with the Indigenous peoples, while initially cordial, began to sour. Misunderstandings, miscommunications, and the heavy hand of disease, which had already begun to ravage the native population, soured what had once been a peaceful exchange. Despite these setbacks, Cartier's voyages ignited a new era of French ambitions in North America. Though he was not successful in founding a permanent settlement on his own, he laid the groundwork for what would soon become the French colony of New France. The fur trade, particularly in beaver pelts, which were in high demand in Europe for making hats, became the centerpiece of French efforts. With the land rich in resources, France's desire to secure and control these vast territories grew stronger. The French quickly realized that they would need more than just initial exploration. They needed permanent settlements to ensure that New France would thrive. The fur trade would become the lifeblood of the colony, and the French, along with their indigenous allies, began to carve out trading routes that stretched across the wilderness, from the St. Lawrence River to the Great Lakes and beyond. The Huron-Wendat, the Algonquin, and other indigenous groups played a vital role in this trade, sharing their deep knowledge of the land and its resources. But this partnership was not without its strain. With the arrival of European goods, particularly alcohol and firearms, the balance of power shifted. Diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which the indigenous people had no immunity, began to ravage communities. What had begun as a trading alliance soon became an unequal relationship, with the French benefiting from the land's riches while the indigenous peoples faced devastating losses. As the fur trade boomed, the French began to focus more on establishing permanent settlements along the St. Lawrence. The colony grew, albeit slowly. By 1608, Samuel de Champlain would establish Quebec City, the first permanent French settlement in Canada. With Champlain's arrival, New France would take shape, but it would be a land still fraught with conflict, where French settlers and indigenous peoples were caught between trade, disease, and the forces of colonization. Yet, the French were not the only Europeans with eyes on this vast, fertile land. As Cartier's voyages began to lay the groundwork for French influence, other European powers, particularly the English, began to turn their gaze northward. The English saw the wealth in the fur trade, the potential for vast new territories, and the opportunity to stake their own claim in the New World. The stage was now set for a conflict that would stretch across centuries, a battle for land, power, and resources that would see France and England locked in an unyielding struggle for control of Canada. At first, the French and English both respected a sort of silent understanding. Their boundaries were loosely defined by the rivers, forests, and mountains that separated them. But that delicate balance would soon be shattered. The Iroquois, who had once traded with the French, had begun to ally with the Dutch and, later, the English, shifting the power dynamics. The Iroquois Confederacy, with their new alliances and weapons supplied by the English, set their sights on the French-controlled fur trade. Armed with European firearms, they launched a series of devastating raids against the French, attacking their trading partners and seeking to control the lucrative trade routes. As the French tried to hold on to their trading posts and alliances, the English, sensing an opportunity, began to edge their way into French territory. Settlements sprouted up along the Great Lakes and the Ohio River Valley, areas that were critical to the fur trade. The French, feeling the pressure, attempted to fortify their positions by building forts and strengthening their alliances with indigenous groups like the Huron and Algonquin, but the English were relentless. The Iroquois, now firmly allied with the English, made sure to disrupt any French efforts to expand their influence. The Beaver Wars were in full swing, raids, attacks, and military confrontations between the French, their indigenous allies, and the Iroquois Confederacy, who were backed by the English. The conflict would rage on for decades, with both sides experiencing losses. The French found themselves desperately fighting to hold their territory, while the Iroquois, armed with English supplies, sought to push further into French-claimed regions. The fur trade was no longer just a matter of business, it had become a matter of survival. The French, who had relied on the indigenous peoples for their knowledge of the land and trading networks, now faced the threat of losing their vital indigenous alliances. The English, while expanding their colonies, found themselves gaining more power by arming the Iroquois and disrupting French interests. The French tried to forge alliances with other tribes, but the Iroquois, backed by English resources, grew more powerful by the year. And by the late 1600s, both the French and English were entrenched in their respective alliances, with the Iroquois playing a critical role as middlemen in the fur trade. The fur trade wars had become part of a larger struggle for control, and the stakes were growing higher. While the French sought to defend their position, the English were more determined than ever to gain dominance over North America. By the early 1700s, the French and English had reached a boiling point. The 7 Years' War, known in North America as the French and Indian War, became an inevitable clash. Both colonial powers, now fiercely entrenched in their ambitions for territorial dominance, were ready to escalate the conflict. What began as a struggle for fur trade and territory had now become a worldwide war, with Europe itself embroiled in the fight for global supremacy. As the war raged on, the Battle of Quebec in 1759 became the pivotal moment that would seal the fate of New France. Montcalm and Wolfe, the two generals who led their forces into battle, would both meet tragic ends, and with their deaths, the balance of power in North America would shift forever. Canada was about to change hands, but the real question remained: what would this mean for the Indigenous peoples, who had fought alongside the French for so long? With the British now in control, what would become of the land they had once shared with the French? With the fall of Quebec, the British gained control of New France. This was not just a victory in battle, it was a complete shift in the balance of power across the continent. The French, who had long ruled the land, were now relegated to a shadow of their former selves in North America. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 formalized this loss, with France ceding almost all of its territories in North America to Britain. The vast territories of New France were now part of the British Empire, and the Indigenous peoples, who had fought alongside the French, were left to navigate a new world under British rule. For the Indigenous nations, the consequences of the British conquest were immediate and profound. Many had fought for the French, hoping that the French alliance would provide stability and a degree of protection from the English expansion. With the French gone, the Indigenous peoples found themselves at the mercy of the British, who had little interest in maintaining the treaties or the alliances that had been forged under French rule. The fur trade, which had been the backbone of New France, continued to thrive under British control, but the relationship between the British and the Indigenous peoples began to sour. The British were more focused on expansion and settlement than trade, and they began to impose policies that undermined the traditional practices of the Indigenous nations. The once mutual exchanges of furs for goods turned into a struggle for survival for many of the Indigenous peoples who had once benefited from the fur trade. The British conquest of New France was not just a military victory, it was the beginning of a new chapter in the history of Canada. The land that had once been under French control was now part of a rapidly expanding British Empire. Settlements began to grow, and English-speaking settlers flooded into the newly acquired territory. The French Canadians, who made up the majority of the population in Quebec, now found themselves a minority in their own land. The language, culture, and traditions that had flourished under French rule were at risk of being erased. As tensions between the British and the French settlers mounted, many began to question their place in this new world. The British government, in an attempt to maintain peace, enacted the Quebec Act of 1774, which allowed French Canadians to practice their Catholic faith and maintain their civil code, but it also solidified British control. It was a compromise, but it did little to calm the growing sense of alienation among the French population. For the Indigenous peoples, the consequences of the British conquest were more severe. As British settlers poured into Quebec, the traditional land and hunting grounds of the Indigenous nations were increasingly encroached upon. The fur trade that had once been a pillar of mutual benefit now began to favor the British, and many Indigenous tribes found themselves caught between competing colonial powers, without the French allies they had once relied on. But the story of Canada was far from over. While the British now controlled the land, conflict still simmered beneath the surface. The French Canadians, the Indigenous nations, and the growing population of British settlers were all on a collision course, and the American Revolution would soon spill across the border, shaking the very foundations of the British Empire in North America. What would happen next, and how would these tensions explode? The land of Canada was about to be reshaped once again. As settlers began flooding into Quebec, the British Empire's ambitions were clear. They sought to expand and control as much of North America as possible. The Treaty of Paris, 1763, which had formally ceded New France to the British, opened up a vast stretch of land ripe for colonization. As English-speaking settlers poured into the region, especially after the American Revolution, tensions began to mount between the French Canadians and the newcomers. These tensions were not just cultural, they were about the future of Canada itself. The American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, which had seen the 13 American colonies rebel against British rule and form the United States, played a pivotal role in the shifting dynamics of Canada. Following the successful American struggle for independence, many Loyalists, those who remained faithful to the British Crown, fled northward, seeking refuge in Canada. They brought with them a strong allegiance to the British Empire and contributed to the growing British population in the region. While the Loyalists settled in places like Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Quebec, they were met with the French Canadians, who now found themselves caught between two worlds. The French Canadians, long accustomed to their French heritage, had been living under British rule for several years, but the sudden influx of Loyalists only added to their frustration. The Loyalists, with their strong ties to the British Empire, were eager to establish a British society, while the French Canadians feared their culture and language would be overrun by this influx of English-speaking settlers. The British had little regard for Indigenous sovereignty, and their policies began to prioritize settlement over trade. In the years that followed, discontent in Canada would grow. French Canadians, Indigenous nations, and Loyalists were all caught in a web of political, cultural, and economic conflict. The pressure was building, revolution was in the air. It was only a matter of time before rebellion broke out. Would the British finally lose their grip, or would the French Canadians and Indigenous peoples be crushed under the weight of the Empire? The battle for Canada's future was about to begin. By 1837, calls for reform had reached a tipping point. The rebellions of 1837–38, led by figures like William Lyon Mackenzie in Upper Canada, now Ontario, and Louis Joseph Papineau in Lower Canada, now Quebec, marked the first serious attempt at challenging British rule in Canada. These uprisings were fueled by economic hardship, political exclusion, and a growing sense of injustice among the French Canadians and English reformers who felt sidelined by the British and their colonial government. In Upper Canada, William Lyon Mackenzie, a journalist and reformer, rallied the people against the Family Compact, a small group of elites who controlled the government. Mackenzie's call for responsible government, where elected officials had control over the colony's decisions, not just the appointed officials, struck a chord with many working-class settlers who felt they were denied a fair voice. Mackenzie's rebellion, though poorly organized, sparked the rebellions of 1837, with rebels taking to arms against the established government. But despite initial resistance, the British quickly crushed the uprisings. Mackenzie and other leaders were forced to flee, but the calls for reform would not fade so easily. In Lower Canada, Louis Joseph Papineau led a similar rebellion, advocating for the rights of French Canadians and protesting against the British government's policies, which many saw as oppressive. Papineau, like Mackenzie, sought political reforms and greater control for French Canadians in their own land. The rebellions of 1837 in Lower Canada were fueled by frustrations over language rights, cultural preservation, and the encroaching British influence. The rebellion was fierce, but like in the North, the British forces eventually defeated the rebels, leading to further alienation of the French Canadian population. Though the rebellions of 1837–38 were ultimately suppressed, they had a profound effect on the future of Canada. The British government, shaken by the uprisings, realized that significant reforms were necessary to prevent future unrest. In 1841, the Act of Union was passed, merging Upper and Lower Canada into the single province of Canada. The goal was to assimilate the French Canadians and ease tensions between the two populations. But rather than uniting the French and English, the Act only intensified the divisions. French Canadians felt betrayed, their political autonomy further eroded, while English-speaking settlers in Upper Canada saw this as an opportunity to exert more control. The Act of Union also came with significant changes to governance, including the creation of a unified government and representative assembly. While the reforms helped reduce tensions in the short term, they did little to satisfy the French Canadians. Their demands for greater political autonomy remained unmet, and the cultural divide between the English and French continued to deepen. The seeds of future conflict had been planted, and the French Canadians found themselves further marginalized. The Act of Union was intended to be a solution to the unrest, but it only postponed the inevitable. The French Canadians, now further alienated, would continue to push for their rights. As the pressures from both within and outside Canada mounted, the stage was set for greater unrest, and this time, the stakes would be higher than ever. Would the French Canadians find a way to assert their power, or would they remain under British control? The next chapter in Canada's history was about to unfold, and it would change the nation forever. It was clear that the British Empire could no longer hold the Canadian colonies together with a single, imposed system. The need for political unity was becoming increasingly urgent, and some voices began to call for a new solution, one that would preserve the French-Canadian identity while allowing the English-speaking settlers to have more influence. The idea of Confederation was born out of this tension. The concept of uniting the colonies into a single federation, with self-government but under the overarching control of the British Empire, appealed to both sides. For the French Canadians, it was an opportunity to protect their cultural identity, while for the English-speaking settlers, it was a chance to strengthen their political and economic influence across a vast and resource-rich territory. In 1864, the Fathers of Confederation began meeting in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, to discuss the future of Canada. John A. Macdonald, a key figure in the movement, was determined to forge a solution that would bring together the English-speaking provinces and French Canadians under one banner. His vision was not just about political union, it was about creating a strong, united, and prosperous nation that could stand against the growing power of the United States to the south. Macdonald, alongside other prominent leaders like Georges-Étienne Cartier, a French Canadian who played a crucial role in ensuring that the French Canadian voice was heard, pushed for the idea of a federal union that would divide power between a central government and provincial governments. This way, the French Canadians would have local control over their affairs while being part of a larger, united country. This compromise allowed the English-speaking settlers to retain a strong central government, while still respecting the rights and interests of the French Canadians. The meetings in Charlottetown were just the beginning, but the groundwork for Confederation was laid. The idea was gaining traction, but it would take years of negotiations, compromises, and political maneuvering before the colonies could actually agree to unite. Despite the enthusiasm for Confederation among many political leaders in Canada, the British government was not fully convinced. Britain had its own priorities, and the colonies were becoming increasingly expensive to maintain. With the American Civil War over and the United States now focused on its own recovery, the British Empire saw the opportunity to scale back its presence in North America. It was a delicate moment, one in which the colonies' desire for self-governance and the British reluctance to continue overseeing them came into sharp focus. At the same time, economic pressures were mounting. The canal systems, the railroads, and the growing demands of trade were creating a sense of urgency. The colonies were looking for ways to expand their economies and protect their borders in the face of a growing American influence. Uniting under a single government seemed the most logical solution to the challenges they faced. The British Empire, increasingly focused on its interests overseas, seemed willing to let the colonies go, provided they could manage their own affairs without threatening British interests. The British reluctance did not deter the Canadian leaders. They understood that for the future of the colonies, Confederation was the key to stability and security. The push for a united Canada was now unstoppable. In 1867, after years of negotiation and compromise, Canada would officially be born. But while the Confederation would unite the colonies into a single, self-governing nation, challenges remained. The issues of French-Canadian autonomy, Indigenous rights, and economic disparity would persist, issues that would shape Canada for years to come. And with Confederation in place, Canada turned its eyes westward, seeking to expand its borders and secure new territories. The completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway, CPR, in 1885 marked a monumental achievement, linking the east and west of the country, but it also signaled the beginning of a harsh new era for the Indigenous peoples and the Métis who lived in the vast prairies of the West. The RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, were created in 1873 to maintain law and order across the prairies and to ensure that settlers could move westward unimpeded. The RCMP's role was to pacify the Indigenous nations and bring them under control as settlers moved onto their ancestral lands. The government saw the expansion as essential for the future of Canada, but the Métis, First Nations, and other Indigenous peoples saw it as an invasion that would forever alter their way of life. In 1885, the Métis, led by the charismatic and controversial figure Louis Riel, rose up in what would become known as the Northwest Rebellion. The rebellion was a response to the government's neglect of the Metis and the constant encroachment on their land. They had been promised protections under the Treaty of 1870, but those promises had largely gone unfulfilled. In the face of settler expansion, Riel and his followers sought to reclaim their rights and preserve their Metis culture. Riel, once exiled to the United States, had returned to lead the rebellion in an attempt to defend the rights of the Metis and indigenous peoples. The rebellion, however, was short-lived. The Canadian military, supported by the RCMP, quickly crushed the Metis forces, and Louis Riel was captured. Despite pleas for mercy, he was tried for treason and executed in November 1885. His execution shocked the Metis and left a deep scar on the Francophone and Indigenous communities. Riel's death remains one of the most controversial and tragic events in Canadian history. For some, he was a martyr who had fought for his people, while for others, he was a traitor who had defied the lawful authority of the state. In either case, Louis Riel's legacy would forever shape the story of Canada's westward expansion and the enduring struggle for Indigenous rights. While the West expanded and Canada took shape, the Indigenous peoples of the land found their lives forever altered. Their culture, land, and sovereignty were gradually stripped away, and the RCMP's role in enforcing this process could not be undone. But the government's next tool of forced assimilation, the residential school system, was about to take center stage. The horrors of this system would change the lives of generations of Indigenous children, and the scars would linger for over a century. With the Metis Rebellion of 1885 crushed and the RCMP continuing their role in enforcing British and Canadian control over the West, a new and more insidious chapter in the history of Indigenous peoples was about to unfold. As Canada expanded and new territories were incorporated, the federal government increasingly viewed Indigenous nations not as sovereign peoples, but as obstacles to the nation's progress. The solution to this growing problem was to impose a systematic and forced assimilation of Indigenous children, which would leave a dark and lasting legacy for generations. The residential school system was born out of the belief that the Indigenous peoples could not be part of Canadian society as they were. The government, supported by churches, sought to civilize and Christianize the Indigenous youth, believing that to do so would eradicate their primitive ways and integrate them into mainstream European Canadian society. The Canadian government, in collaboration with the Roman Catholic, Anglican, United, and Presbyterian churches, established a network of residential schools across the country, beginning as early as the mid-1800s, but formalized with the Indian Act of 1876. By the late 19th century, the system was fully entrenched. Indigenous children as young as 4 years old were forcibly removed from their homes, often with the full support of the RCMP, and sent to residential schools far from their families. These schools were designed to strip away every aspect of their Indigenous identity. They were forced to speak only English or French, forbidden to speak their native languages, and their cultural traditions were banned. Religious conversion was a primary focus, with Indigenous children being taught Christianity and forced to adopt Western customs, dress, and values. The conditions within these schools were often horrific. The children were subjected to physical and emotional abuse, and many were forced into hard labor with little to no education. Starvation, disease, and poor sanitation were rampant, and it is estimated that at least 150,000 Indigenous children were forced through this system over a period of more than a century. Some children never made it home, they died of malnutrition, disease, or the sheer trauma of the experience. Families were left broken, not knowing if their children would return, and if they did, they were often unrecognizable, having been taught to abandon their culture and identity. The Indigenous communities were devastated by the residential school system, which caused deep, generational trauma. The children who survived these institutions returned to their communities deeply changed, often unable to speak their native languages or practice their traditions. The psychological and emotional scars of residential schools left many with a profound sense of alienation and loss that lasted their entire lives. Many families were separated, and for those that did not see their children again, there was a haunting sense of grief and despair that lingered for generations. For decades, the true horrors of the residential school system remained hidden, kept from the public eye by the government and the churches that ran the schools. But as survivors began to speak out, their stories of abuse, neglect, and cultural genocide slowly began to emerge. In the 1980s and 1990s, survivors began to demand recognition for what they had suffered. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, established in 2008, was a response to these demands, giving survivors a platform to share their stories and officially documenting the abuses that had taken place. In 2008, the Canadian government issued a formal apology to the survivors of the residential school system, acknowledging the immense harm caused by these institutions. However, the damage done to Indigenous communities was not easily erased. The TRC found that the residential schools were part of a larger strategy of cultural genocide, aimed at eradicating Indigenous cultures, languages, and identities. The legacy of these schools still impacts Indigenous communities today, from the loss of traditional knowledge to the ongoing trauma and struggles that survivors and their descendants face. But even as the residential school system came to an end, another chapter in this painful journey unfolded: the 60s scoop. In the 1960s, a new wave of government policy began, one that would further tear families apart. This time, it wasn't through schools, but through the foster care system. The 60s scoop involved the systematic removal of Indigenous children from their families, placing them into non-Indigenous foster homes or putting them up for adoption, often without the consent of their families. The government's belief was that these children would have a better life with white families, away from what they considered the disadvantaged life of Indigenous communities. But in reality, this policy stripped children of their cultural identity and family ties. Children were taken away from their languages, traditions, and communities, growing up disconnected from their roots. The trauma of the 60s scoop was not just about loss, it was about erasure, a severing of Indigenous heritage that would be passed down for generations. The lasting effects of this era are still felt today. Those who were part of the 60s scoop grew up feeling displaced, isolated, and disconnected from their Indigenous heritage. The trauma of being taken from their families and culture has carried into their lives and their children's lives, leaving emotional scars that have yet to fully heal. The Indigenous peoples of Canada have had to fight for recognition of the damage done during the 60s scoop, and to demand that the government acknowledge the pain inflicted on the children and the families that were torn apart. But through the darkness, there was a flicker of hope. In 2008, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, was established to investigate the residential school system and the ongoing effects of colonialism on Indigenous peoples. The TRC's mission was simple: to uncover the truth about the systemic abuse and cultural genocide that Indigenous peoples faced and to begin the process of healing. For many survivors, this was the first time their voices were heard, their pain acknowledged, and their stories validated. The TRC's work was groundbreaking. It was not just about documenting the history, it was about starting the journey toward reconciliation. The Commission published its findings in 2015, which included a call to action for all Canadians to engage with the painful truths of this history and work toward a better future. For the Indigenous communities, the TRC was a vital step toward healing, though the journey ahead was far from over. Though Canada has made strides in acknowledging its colonial past, the battle for Indigenous rights continues. Issues of sovereignty, language rights, and cultural preservation are still at the forefront of the Indigenous struggle. Indigenous nations continue to fight for the right to control their own lands, to speak their own languages, and to pass on their cultural heritage to future generations. While progress has been made, such as the declaration of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, and the legal victories in land claims, the work is not done. Indigenous self-determination remains a key issue, and Canada's history is still being written. As the country continues to reckon with its past, the question remains: how can Canada fully reconcile with its Indigenous peoples and ensure their voices are not just heard, but respected? The history of Canada is far from simple. It is a story of resilience, sacrifice, and the enduring struggle for justice and equality. Indigenous peoples, despite the traumas they have faced, have continued to fight, survive, and thrive, always holding on to the hope of a future that recognizes their inherent rights and dignity. Canada, too, is still evolving, grappling with its past while striving to build a better, more inclusive future. So, what do you think is the most defining moment in Canada's history? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video insightful, please like and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth looks at history. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.